Hi, welcome back. So far in our lectures, we learned about two out of the three components of an MVC framework. We learned about the controllers, we learned about the models, and today we are going to spend a significant amount of time in this lecture and the next in looking more at the third component, which is the view, which is the V of an MVC. Now, in order for us to understand how views work, it's important to understand the difference between what we call client-side languages and server-side languages. And the reason why we absolutely want you to understand the distinction is because really when you start using frameworks, views are not necessarily client-side languages. Views are really logic that is executed on the server side, and then it is turned to your browser to display. Okay, this will become clearer and clearer after we finish the session today. The best way probably to illustrate to you the difference between client-side languages and server-side languages is to see it in action. On the client side of things, there are several languages that are executed on the client. And what do we mean by the client? The client really means, in web programming, it means the browser. So there is a certain set of languages that the browser can interpret and can automatically compile and execute. Okay, those are HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Okay, those are like the main common ones that your browser, and any browser, whether it's Chrome, whether it's Firefox, whether it's Firefox as in Mozilla, or Internet Explorer, those are interpreters and compilers of CSS, HTML mainly, and JavaScript. Okay, so when we talk about client-side languages, those are mainly in web programming the languages that we mean, and those are compiled on the browser. When we talk about server-side languages, there is an entire set of languages that a server can handle. Okay, so PHP happens to be one of them, but Python, for example, is another language that is also or can be interpreted on the server side. JavaScript is also with Node.js, if you heard of Node.js before, is also both a server and a language, okay, that can happen on the server side of things. And there are other languages as well that can happen or that can be compiled and interpreted on the server. For as far as this course is concerned, and as far as calligraphy is concerned, calligraphy uses PHP. PHP is a server-side language, but PHP is not a server. PHP needs a server in order to process it and in order to allow it to be interpreted. This is why we use Apache with it. If you are using a completely other framework that is mainly JavaScript oriented, then in that case, that server uses Node.js. It doesn't use Apache and PHP, for instance, but it uses Node.js, which is a packaged JavaScript written application that has both the server side and an interpreter for interpreting JavaScript. Okay, and all of those are happening on the server side. So let me illustrate to you the difference between client and server, and this would be a great segue before we start talking about the views in the calligraphy framework. So in order for me to do that, let me create a file on my desktop. Okay, well, actually, let me do it directly from an editor. So I'm going to open my desktop here, and I'm going to create a file on my desktop. Let's call it mypage.html, because HTML is really a language that is interpreted on the machine, so on the client itself, and it's going to get executed in the browser. And we're going to use Chrome, but you can use any other browser, and it would be the same thing. Now, HTML, of course, this course is not about learning HTML and CSS or JavaScript. This course is actually not about UI design, even though the framework itself does not do anything different for you to create CSS and JavaScript. Okay, so if you want to do this, this would make your UI even more powerful. The framework is not about that. Okay, the framework is mainly about serving the data to the views, and we'll talk about the views in a while. So let's talk about HTML, for instance. So if you want to write HTML code, of course, again, this is not about HTML per se, but we're going to do something very quickly over here. So an HTML is a structural language, which means it's a layout language. It defines the layout of a document, which happens to be a web page in this particular case. It has no styling, it has no formatting, and on its own, it serves the only purpose of laying out the document and structuring the document in a way that could be easily read by something like the browser, for instance. Okay, in order to format things, it needs a layer on top, which is what we call style sheets, and this is where CSS comes into play. CSS is another language that allows you to format an HTML page. So this course is not about telling you how to design or how to create HTML and CSS. You can use this in your own time and go and try to create and learn about both HTML and CSS. So now let's start with HTML and create something basic so that we see and understand the concept of a client-side language versus a server-side language. So an HTML structure, it usually has a head and has a body, okay? And it's all in between an HTML tag. Within the head, you can have things like a title, and the title would be the title of the page. Let's call it our Hello World HTML. And then the body usually, since HTML5, it has something called the header, which can be in navigation and things like that. And one of the things that you can put in the header is what we call an H1. An H1 is the first header or first heading that will be read in your page. So H1 is, let's say, and you don't necessarily, you can all put it on one line, for instance, and let's call it heading 1. Okay, this is like the main, let's call it main heading for us. And this will be printed out on the page. Then within the body, you can have several other sections. So this is an example of a section. You can have several ones. It could be section, it could be a div if you've used div before. So in the new HTML5, we recommend that you use sections. Okay, so now that you have a section, the section can have a second heading. So let's say this is my first section over here. Okay, and then we can have a paragraph, and that paragraph, this is, let's say, a paragraph of the first section. Okay, and you can have multiple ones of those. So I could, copy and paste it several times. I could also have a footer in my body, and that footer, can do something like having a copyright, for example, and let's say copyright 2019, just to simplify all this. Now, why am I creating this file? Because I want you to understand that, and here's my file, by the way, it's on my desktop. If you double click on it, it's going to open it in a browser. Okay, here you go. And as you can see, it has some, basic styling on it when no styling is defined, but ideally it is meant to give you a structure of your page. Okay, and if you notice, we did not need any server. There is no Apache involved in here. We did not have to put it, in the document root folder. It is really on our desktop, and we directly opened it in the browser. Okay, and the browser is capable of reading HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and to output something for you on the screen. Now let me go back to the code. We learned in the beginning of this course that PHP is a scripting language. In fact, there are lots of other scripting languages, and most of the of the server-side languages that are interpreted on the server, they are meant to be scripted, meaning they could be included within an HTML. What do I mean by this? Within the same file, I could open a tag here and say this is a PHP, okay? And I'm going to say dot title, which is our variable title. I'm going to say hello world HTML. and close it, okay? And then instead of saying hello world here, I am going to echo dollar title, okay? Which ideally should display my title should this be under a server. Because right now, if I go back to my home and I refresh that page, it's not reading anything about my PHP. Why? Because the browser doesn't know anything about the PHP. PHP is not interpreted on the browser. It needs a server to be interpreted. Now, if I take this file, and let's take it, minimize the browser over here, and we're going to put it in the document root. My document root is sites, okay? And I'm going to put it directly in there. But now I need to tell the server that this is a PHP. So I'm going to switch it and I'm going to change it to a PHP. And notice that the PHP also reads HTML, no problem. So now what's happening is when I go to my browser and I do localhost / my page .php. Now this is being served by the server. So what is happening is that this file is no longer necessarily executed immediately on the browser, but it's passing the request to the server. The server is reading the file and it's determining what pieces it's going to interpret itself and what pieces it's going to give to the browser to continue executing. So the server is going to read the PHP script that is contained within our file. So now it's no longer here. Now I'm going to go to site, sorry. So let's go back to our sites now in order to see our file. And let's open it entirely, okay? Here we go. And now I'm going to look for my page. Oh, there are lots of stuff in here. All right, this might, this is going to make it crash. Let's open my page. Sorry, it's lagging a bit. Sure. So let me, then in that case, it might be a little too big to open. I'm going to directly open the file. So I'm going to say I want to open my PHP, but I can't do that. So let me then do something else. Let me create a folder, and then we're going to call it test course. And then we're going to copy our file to test course. So my page, where is it? Here, we're going to take it. Nope, I don't want to open it. I want to move it. I'm having trouble moving it for some reason. Let's go back here. Okay, I'm going to copy like that. And then I'm going to paste it in here. I'm going to make sure to delete it from here. Okay. So now if I go, I need to add a test course over here. Okay. And if we open the code for test course, okay, the PHP script, whether it's here or whether it's here, is going to be executed by our server, and then the server is going to hand off everything for the browser to execute. Okay, so let's see the result now. The result is going to be the same for you, okay? The title, if you look at over here, it's Hello World HTML, which is taking it from the PHP script. If I change this and I say Hi World, okay, and I refresh the page, again it's saying hi world, so it is taking it from the PHP. So what's important here is to understand how the flow of data is happening. So the browser is sending the entire file to the server is receiving the PHP file, it is dissecting it in a way where it takes only the languages that it understands, which in our case happens to be PHP. It's going to compile it, execute it, and then return the outcome with the rest of the code that it does not understand, such as HTML and CSS, and then the browser will handle the rest. All right. Now, the fact that both both PHP and HTML or CSS or client-side languages are all part of the same file, it makes it harder for the server to dissect, obviously. Why? Because now the server needs to go through each and every piece and identify what pieces are understood by it and what pieces it can interpret, and all the other pieces needs to send them back to the browser. So down the road, it might create a lot of performance issues whenever you're merging both scripts and HTML significantly in the same file. Okay, obviously because it's a lot for the server to handle. This is what we call or in the new world, there is this concept or this school of thought that any language side or server side language and client side language need to be separated. Okay, separated in different files or even separated entirely. Meaning that let's let either the server handle executing the HTML or rendering the HTML, or let's let the browser handle everything. Okay, and those are the two schools, and both of them they talk about this separation of concerns. So every time you hear the word separation of concerns, what is meant by it is the separation of the client side logic from the server side logic. And that is exactly what something like a framework can help you do in a very seamless way. Which leads us to the gist of our lecture today. So now I'm gonna go back, open back our showcase application, and I'll minimize it, and then we can close this. Okay, and let's get back to our calligraphy course. The lecture that we're concerned with today is the lecture around the views and the HTML template engines. We understood what the separation of concern is, hopefully, by now. And one reason for using views is specifically for this, for separating the concerns so that the logic is all handled in the case of calligraphy on the server side, and it's only going to give to the browser the end result to be displayed. Everything, remember, everything is handled on the server side. Even the HTML creation is also created on the server side, and then the whole code or the whole HTML and CSS that is resulting from the execution will be displayed by the browser. Okay, so this is lecture number 9, and we're going to learn how it's done in calligraphy. Calligraphy uses Pug. Pug is yet another language that is compiled on the server. Okay, uh, Pug is not HTML. Pug is a scripting language that is handled by PHP in this particular case. So it's PHP that is rendering all the syntax for Pug or PHP Pug, which is an abbreviation for FUG. So FUG is a language that is interpreted by PHP itself on the server, and it's generating HTML and CSS as an output for the browser to read. So I wanted you specifically to understand that nuance between FUG and HTML so that you don't confuse the two. FUG is not executed on the browser. FUG is interpreted by the PHP interpreter, okay? And without PHP, FUG cannot be understood by the browser. All right, now that we got this, let's replicate that code that we just created in FUG, okay? So how do we do this? There is this layer called the view that we finally get to. So the view in calligraphy uses FUG. So just like we created controllers and just like we created models, we are going to create views. So let's create a folder in here. We're going to call it showcase, like that. Okay, and under showcase, we're going to create our first file, and let's call it index.pug. Whatever we created, it always needs to end with pug, because that is the language, and that's how we determine how to create a pug file. Okay, so that the server can understand it. Now let's try to recreate, but instead of typing HTML and closing HTML tags, Pug language does not use any tags. What it uses is plainly the name of the tag. So instead of doing HTML tags, what we're going to do is just simply write HTML like that. And it understands that now I am starting and closing an HTML tag. Great. But now I want to have something within those tags. So how does PHP understand the concept of starting and ending? It does it by indentation. So every time I indent using a tab, okay, it understands that everything that is indented belongs to HTML. So now what I can do is I can say, this is my head, okay, and it understands that it will close automatically. This is my body, okay, and then within my body, I am going to have a header, and I am going to have a section, and I am going to have a footer. Great. So far, it seems like it's very straightforward. Every time you want it to be contained within a particular tag, you would indent. Now I want to create within my head, I want to create an H1. So I will say H1 hello world. Notice that I put a space in here and the color changed because it did identify that it's a pug language. So it's giving me this this indicator that the text in here is really the text that is going to be contained within the H1 tag. And notice I did not need to put an enter and indent here. Okay, whenever you are putting it on the same line, it understands that at the end of the line it will close the tag for you, especially when it's a plain text. So this now will give us the header. Now, the head. Now let's talk about the header. In my header, we said that we wanted the title somewhere in here. Sorry, the H1 should be under header. So let's do that. Make sure that the indentation works properly. And under here, we are going to have a title. And let's call the title, what was it again? Hi World, okay, for the time being. And now in my section, I'm going to put an H2. I'm going to say this is section 1. Okay. And then we're going to create a paragraph. And this is our first section paragraph. Great. And in my footer, we said we are just simply going to have copyright in a text and then 2019. You can add space enters just to space it out. This code is exactly the one that we wrote in HTML earlier, but notice how simpler it is. And this is, in my opinion, the beauty of Pug. There is a little bit of a learning curve to understand the syntax of Pug. I will try as much as possible to give you the big concepts, but then in our reference lecture, you have a reference to the Pug language, where you could go ahead and learn more about it. I would refer to it every once in a while, but again, it's a very simple syntax. Especially if you know HTML, it will become a lot easier when you start writing in the Pug language. All right. So now remember, all this is executed on the server. So now I created an index.pug, but how can I let my controller output this for me? Because I still need either a controller or a route to do that for me. So let's go ahead and create a controller. In our showcase, we're going to create a temporary controller over here, and let's call it page controller for the time being. Okay, and page controller is a PHP. Remember, it's a controller, so we need to add the namespace. Then what we're going to say, it's a class, and we are going to call it page controller, and it extends controller. and then we're going to have a public index init function. Okay, what I wanted to do now, I wanted to display or to render the PUC file and return it to my display. So what I can do is I'm going to say return. There is a core helper method called view, okay, which does all the magic for you, and all it needs is the name of the template or the PUG file or the PUG template that it will be using. So in order to do this, we need to really give it the path for the template. And Calligraphy knows that it needs to look in the view folder. So everything that we need to tell it go to showcase and get the index. So we're going to say showcase/index. Okay, and this should do it. Okay, now this is going to execute my my index or everything that is contained within my index. So now let's go and create a route for this. I'm going to say route get /test template, or let's call it yes, test template, like that. And then we're going to be calling page controller, and since it's the index, we don't need to specify the method. I need to close the quotes here and close the quote here, and I'm going to save it. So now when we go to localhost, notice, and now I am going, it's all happening in the browser again, but it's through the server, and I'm going to say test template. Ah, we have a problem. Of course, because it needs to be first, okay? Remember that order, otherwise it's going to think it's an ID. So let's put it first over here just to avoid any problems. And now let's do it. And here we go. This executed exactly the same thing. If you look at the source of the file by right-clicking on the page, what the page is getting at the end of the day, it's getting an HTML. Okay, but the difference between what we did here and what we did earlier as an HTML file, the HTML file that we created the entire code, whereas here it's the server that is creating the code for us, and it's doing it through the PUG language. Okay, and that is the beauty of the separation of concern. Is that everything is done and compiled on the server, and then the browser is only receiving the output. All right. So I hope this was, clarified a little bit the distinction between the two. Now what we're gonna explore even more is how to create PUG and to understand better the language. So this is plain HTML, but what if we want to add some dynamic data in here? So let's say over here we do not want to do this. What we want to do really is we want to get this data from the controller. We want the controller to give us everything in here. So let's do this, and I will show you different syntaxes that you could use in order to do this. Like this, you get a variety of things. One of the syntax, you can add an equal here and say I want it to get $title, and it's just like you define variables in PHP. You could do the same thing with PUG. Great. Another way of doing it is keep it as a string, but when you add the curly brackets like that, okay, and you do $title, PUG or PHP, when it's interpreting it, will understand. Sorry, it's not a title. What do we want to call it? Let's call it our heading. $heading. It will understand that this is a variable coming from PHP. So it will execute it for you. All right. So this is a second way of doing it. Let's over here say equal. This is our heading 2. And we're going to say equal. This is our paragraph. And we're going to save it. Now if you go and try and execute this, it's going to just say whatever. Okay, it doesn't know anything about them. So it will leave them empty basically. Now, we need to add this, okay? This is called interpolation because we want it to execute whatever is in there. and now it's going to most likely not do anything, okay, because the variables are empty. So now our big challenge is how can we let the controller pass variables and pass specifically these variables to the view. So when we go to page controller, we can add an argument in here, and that second argument is an array of everything, all the variables that we need to pass to our view. How do we do this? We're going to say we need a title, and this is really the equivalent of what the pug has. Okay, notice we don't add the dollar sign when we're passing it along, and we're going to say that our title is hi or hello from pug. Okay, and then we need to pass it a heading. I believe that's how I call it, but let's double check. Yes, a heading, and our heading is going to say heading 1. Okay, and then I think we created the second one was heading 2. Yep, and heading 2 will be this is section header. And then we have a paragraph, which I believe we called paragraph. And we're going to say this is our paragraph from Pug. Now let's look at the output. And here we go. Now we were able to read variables from PHP and output them directly to the view. Now notice the beauty of the separation of concern. Everything that's happening in the controller is what the main logic of your application need to be. All the main logic happens there. The brain is always in the controller, and what it's going to give to the view is just the data that you want to display. And when it goes to the view, Pug will take care of the data, okay, and then it will display it as it will format it as an HTML along with any CSS applied to it, and it will give it for the browser to read. This is really in just everything that the views and the templates are about. Now let's keep on going. Let's go back to our index view. Now, in case you want to use some CSS in there, okay? You do it exactly like you do it with HTML. So, for example, if the body needs a certain class, typically in HTML, and I will do it here, you would say body class equal, okay, and then you might add some other stuff. In Pug, it would be exactly the same thing, but you put it in parentheses, and you're gonna say it's a body and it has class, and you name the class, and then you separate them with commas if there is something else that you want to do, like ID, for example, and then you can add an ID to this. All right. Now we don't have any CSS at this stage of the game, so we cannot reference any classes or any CSS classes, but we will see some examples where we could use this. Okay. All right. So now that we understood this, let's take some time in understanding how what PHP comes out of the box with. Because PHP doesn't, Calligraphy, sorry, I said PHP. Calligraphy doesn't necessarily want you to recreate themes and things like that. You can, but this course is not about creating a theme, like a visual theme to use on PHP, even though it would be very easy to do it. But we're not going to do it together because it requires a lot of bug fixing and things like this when you're dealing with UI, and it needs more time than this course would allow us to do. If you look at under the views, there is something called default. Default is something that comes pre-packaged with Calligraphy that already has a template created for you, and that template uses Bootstrap CSS. So if you're familiar with Bootstrap CSS, Bootstrap is a fantastic library that is quite used on the web, that already has basic components that are very well formatted for you to use, and it works beautifully on different sizes of devices. So it could be a mobile phone, or it could be a tablet, or it could be a desktop. It doesn't matter. If you use it the right way, it has a fantastic responsive layout. That's how we call it. That would allow you to have this fluid design. Okay, so Calligraphy uses Bootstrap, and then it has its own styling applied on top of it. Okay, and then on top of all this, it built views for you to use by just simply calling them. And that's really the beauty. And we're gonna use this a lot, and when we create our forms in our next lecture, to have something already out of the box for us, instead of spending a lot of time trying to create our own UIs and our own templates. So we're gonna use the default template. Now, the default template, let's open it up, because there are several folders in there. There's a folder called master, and there's a folder called modules. The folder master is really where the template is defined. Okay, you can define more templates to whichever way you want. But the master template is defined under master, and any template that you create, if you want to use exactly what Calligraphy is giving you, you will need to extend these templates, and I will show you how to do it. So let's go and take a look at the basic template. The basic template has the HTML tag, similarly to what we just did. It has a head, similarly to what we just did. It has a body, okay, and over here you see that it's using a class, and that class is using a certain CSS that comes out of the box with Calligraphy. So let me segue a little bit over here and show you where that CSS is, and any JavaScript that this thing is using, where are they located in Calligraphy. And this is, if you remember well, when we initially looked at the structure of Calligraphy, there is a public folder. This is exactly where all of the CSS and JavaScript magic is happening. They are all defined under public. So anything that our views are using is in the public folder. The CSS is there, so it's using these CSSs to render the pages, and it's using those JavaScripts to use within the views. Okay, so when I say class color 4, that means somewhere in here in our style CSS, and if I search for color 4, here we go. It is using a class that is defined in that CSS. Okay, now I told you earlier that it's also using Bootstrap, and I will show you in a while where this is defined. So let me go back to layout over here. Okay, so this is our body. Then within Pug, you can do a lot of things, and this is where we're going to go and refer to the language, because there are some basic paradigms and concepts that are absolutely necessary for you to know when you're writing code in Calligraphy, and I will point them out to you. This is the Pug language. You can either look at the Pug, so if you do a search on Pug in Google, you will also get a reference to the Pug language itself. And Pug is exactly the same thing, but it's written for PHP purposes. You can check either one of these references. I would directly go to Pug, okay, because it's directly using the syntax that we need. Like this, you don't need to translate that. And I will point out to you in here. It would be extremely helpful for you to read everything that is under the section language reference, okay? But the main ones that we're going to care about are the following. We're going to care about conditionals. We're going to care about includes. We're going to care about template inheritance, interpolation, and iteration, okay? Those will give you a fundamental knowledge for you to be able to use, or to at least understand the default theme that is contained within Calligraphy. Let's start with conditionals. Conditionals is how can I do an if-else in in Calligraphy, and specifically in the PUC script. If you look at the syntax, it's as easy as this. If, no spacing, no nothing, and then you would, this is showing you how it's done in JavaScript, and then how it's done in PHP style. What we care about is the PHP style, okay? So it's an if, and then you would add a dollar. So if variable something equal to something, whatever the statement is, and then you indent. Everything that's indented is part of the if, and then you would go back, put it in an else, if you do another if, and then an else, and then you make sure to indent. Okay? So now let me go back to the code. What this code is saying is if the variable authorized is set to true, then give me this block of code, and I will tell you what block is in a while, but the whole thing is execute the statement for me. And if it's an else, execute the statement for me, and so on and so forth. So this is how we do conditionals. Great. Now let me talk about block. In order for us to understand block, you need to understand template inheritance. Template inheritance means that there is a template, there is a main one, okay? And that main one is defining pieces of code that later on we can determine what they are. And by later on, it means any other file that is extending this file can define what these are. Now let's go back to the code. Layout over here is defining a block, and it's saying that block is called navigation authorized. But I do not want to define it in this file. I want any other file that is extending layout to define what this block is if they need it. Great. Let's go take a look at layout blocks. Layout blocks, look at it on top. It is extending layout. So what layout block is going to do, it's going to really define what each and every one of these blocks that are defined in layout is going to do. So now if I look at layout, it says I need to find navigation authorized. There are other ones, navigation default, then content, then script, and footer. So now layout blocks, if I go to it, does it have a headers too? Yes, it does, and headers. So layout blocks is really going to be the place where my headers is coded, where my navigation default, navigation authorized, content, footer, scripts are determined. Now notice that content is not defined in here. So really, layout blocks does not want to define content, and it wants to leave it to another file that would extend layout blocks to determine it. Okay, and we'll see how this is done when we look at a third file later on. But if you look at the code that is contained within each one of these blocks, it's nothing more but HTML kinda pug. it's an HTML tags, okay, similarly to what we saw earlier, that is determining what the code is within each and every block. And it, of course, it uses some conditionals, and it uses something else as well that is not part of inheritance but part of inclusion. So this is our third concept in FUG called include. What include does, include is as if you're taking a block of code that is in a completely different file and you're just copying it and pasting it directly into the code. So here's an example. What this is telling us over here, it is telling us that if there is a variable metadata that has been defined, we would like to include a file that is under modules, metadata, and we want to include that metadata.pug file. Let's go take a look at that. I am a master. It's telling me go back one by doing those // It means go back one, go to modules, and then go to metadata.pug and take whatever is in there and paste it in here. So let's go take a look. Anything that's in there, it's another set of pug code, and then we're going to take this whole thing and it will be not displayed, but it will be pasted as if it's part of that code. Okay, so inclusion is another way to define components. It's used for that purpose. Every reusable component that you want to recreate, instead of having to type this over and over again, you would create a PUC file that has that content and you would include it in your anywhere where you want to use it. This is our third concept, that is inclusion. So we talked about conditionals, we talked about inheritance, we talked about interpolation, which really is how we output variables, similarly to what we did, okay? And now we are talking about inclusion. All right, those are four of the main ones that we want to talk about. And then next time when we start building views for our application, after we do the forms, we will be able to talk about iteration. All right, now let me go back to the code a little bit. So now we understand layouts, we understand what the layout block is giving us. There is one more file that is giving that is making use, if you want, of layouts and layout blocks. So let's go and take a look at it. It's index.pug. Index.pug, notice it's extending layout blocks. Okay, so index is going to go and take all the blocks that are defined in here and consider them as part of its code. And layout blocks extends layout. So basically index is really applying that same structure, okay? And for every block, it is taking it from layout blocks, and when the block is not defined in layout blocks, it is defining it itself. So index needs to have a content, otherwise we will have a missing block. So let's take a look at index, and yes, it does define a block. All this to tell you that if you want to use the templates that are provided to you by Caligraphy, such as this one, let's go back to our index over here. And what we're going to say that our showcase index will extend layout blocks. So we need it now to go back one and go to master and go to layout blocks. So we're going to go back one, go to master, go to layout blocks, like that. And we want it to extend that. And we're going to put a semicolon. Okay, so now we have everything. We don't have to put the semicolon actually, so let's avoid doing that. Okay, and now we don't need HTML in head. Okay, and we don't need a body. We don't need the title either, because all of these are defined by, and we don't need a header either. All we need is to say that this is block content, like that. And we're going to indent this. We don't even need a footer, so I will eliminate that. Yes, let's keep the heading. And yes, let's keep the paragraph. And this is using the structure defined by views. We don't have any formatting right now, but we are still using the template that is provided by Caligraphy. Okay. So now let's go and try and run it and see if we run into any problems. Of course we do. Maybe we need to go one more. Yes, sorry. So we go back one, then we go to default, master, layout blocks. Voila. Now notice everything in here. This is our paragraph from Pug, actually. This is exactly what we want. And our heading, we don't see it because it's hidden under this bar. So over here, you need to understand a little bit the CSS. So I advise you to go read all the classes that are in the CSS, because I will not spend much time on it, but I would rather immediately apply it. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to add a spacer in here. And the spacer, it just adds a vertical space. I'm going to say it's a spacer of 4 in order for us to see the heading. Here we go. And here we go. It's our our section header. It was hidden behind the bar. And notice that, you know, the bar, the footer, they all come as part of the package of Calligraphy. Notice how we did not, all we had to do is really understand the structure that is given to us. You can create your own structure and that will be just fine. There will be no conflicts. For the sake of this course, we are going to use the styling as well as the theme, the default theme that is given to us by Calligraphy, just to accelerate the process. In the future, we might have some other courses on how we could create our own themes, but for the time that we have for this course, let's dedicate the time to understand Calligraphy rather than spending it on the visual side of things. All right, so at least we got a basic understanding of what views are, what templating is, which is exactly what this whole thing is doing for us. And ideally, if you understand this well, you'll be able to replicate your own templates on your own. You don't necessarily have to change the default in here, even though you could, but you probably don't want to alter what is given to you out of the box. Always you can create folders, and these folders will not conflict with each other if you define them in the correct way. In the next lecture, we are going to create a form, a proper form that would map to the creation of projects that we had. Okay, and then we might create a page. We will start actually with that page where it will help us display the different projects in a more appealing way. The section today was mainly for us to get introduced to Pug, to the idea of the views, and to the templates. And hopefully from now until the next lecture, you will spend a little bit of time in understanding Pug, okay? So that you'll have a basic understanding of the code that we're going to be using. And I would strongly advise just for you to keep up with how I'm doing certain things, to understand the different classes that are within style.css under public, because we are going to rely on these significantly the next time around. Okay, and I will show you how in Pug, when we're writing Pug code, and let me go back here, how we can include those classes that we see in the CSS in very interesting ways. One interesting way that we saw right now, which by the way did not need a semicolon, is a spacer 4. If you look at style.css, if I look for spacer 4, spacer 4 is a CSS class, okay? And the way I referenced it from the PHP, from the Pug, if I go back to the Pug, I just called it by adding a dot. If I were to do the same thing in HTML, it would look like something like this. Div class spacer 4. And then you will need to close the tag. So instead of typing all this, all I did is do a dot spacer dash 4. And the Pug understands that everything that starts with a dot is a div, and it appends to it class spacer 4. It's such a savior, and it saves you so much time and space. Yes, it is a small learning curve to understand the syntax, but once you do, there is no way to go back to HTML. You will find HTML too heavy to use. With that, I will end this lecture today. The lecture of today, we will end it right now. Hopefully you will spend time on both the fug reference and on style.css. And if you want, and you want to take it further, you can go ahead and start looking into what each one of these modules are doing. Right now, you don't have to worry about them that much. We will talk about them as we advance in our lectures. I wish you a fantastic day. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to our next lecture.